Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP-1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome everybody to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Rafi Jamgochin of Triada Networks. Did I get that right?
You did.
Close.
Perfect.
Man, wow, first time for everything. Welcome.
Thank
Rafi,
you. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you joining the show. We've had some good conversations in the past. Actually, we've had a lot of conversations in the past. But you kind of brought something up. We were on Slack and you mentioned talking about privacy and talking about a shift to SASE. And for those of you that are out there that don't know what SASE means, it's an attitude that Rafi and I both have taken.
That's right.
It's a very sassy attitude.
Very sassy attitude.
That's right. So for those of you who don't know, it stands for Secure Access Service Edge. I'd liken that to things like how you might use Duo or some of these other products and services to access cloud infrastructure without being as concerned about the location I'm connecting from, or being able to have some criteria around, based on your location, this is the level of access you're going to get. Is that
Correct.
Is that about right?
Yeah, it's basically you're merging in the idea of, you're instead of protecting somebody within your four walls, now you're doing protecting around the asset regardless of where they are, and then also protecting what they're allowed to do based on, level of service, where they are, who they are, all that stuff.
Which kind of goes back to the patterns emerging from 2020 and work from home,
Yeah.
This remote isolation. I think they said that we've improved our security posture in 1 year what had taken 5 years prior, because so many people had the opportunity to shift their way of thinking, to look at things through a different lens. And I think kind of comes back to where you and I started the conversation of like, why are my clients asking for these things? I think is directly tied to the idea that many of them will never return back to the corporate office normalcy.
Yeah, we were having a conversation with a client today. He's an insurance provider, but also has kind of like sublet some space people to work in, and that's exactly the conversation we had. We said the normal that happened last year in 2020 was this all remote, and this post-pandemic, whatever you want to call it, this period is not the way it's going to be where it was.
Sure.
And it's not exactly going to be the way it currently is. It's something else.
Right.
And people call it hybrid, whatever, but we're seeing so many different things. And I think and at the same time as we're looking at people migrating to more cloud services.
Yeah.
So the resources you're consuming are not in the four walls. So what's the purpose of a VPN? What are these things? So now you eliminate VPN, and now you eliminate, you're now providing cloud connectivity to your cloud services from anything, anywhere. And then like security gets out the window. And so now It's time to kind of dial that back in.
Right. I was reading a report recently that was talking about 2020 versus 2021 and like executive buy-in to cybersecurity and budgets. And it was really interesting. If I look back, is your organization more secure today than it was a year ago? 3% said no in 2021 versus 5% saying no in 2020. But what was really interesting is if you look at the same versus not same, 2020 view was saying that 14% says that they haven't changed. So like 2020 to 2021, but the 2021 view was saying we've had significant change. In fact, it's doubled as far as feeling more confident with our security posture. All in, they're basically saying that there was this sense though of security in 2020 that is less true today, because they've uncovered in 2020 all these things that were wrong,
Yeah.
which is an opportunity to fix versus the unknown until an exploit happens.
Right. Exactly.
Which was huge. So I also saw that they were saying that IT budgets for cybersecurity, that there's been a demand increase of anywhere from 40 to 70% based on this idea that you may not be going back to that normal office space. So I think it's ironic because I remember, back in 2005 when I first decided to be a consultant, I worked from home. Like I moved from
Yeah.
working in a corporate office to working from home, and no one asked me questions about what kind of security I had or how great my firewall was. It was more of like, can you connect and do stuff? You fast forward and we're literally engaging that same model only because of that's tied to what happened last year. So you made the comment about the sort of this model of whether it's hybrid or whatever you want to call it happening. I've also seen one where their corporate environment isn't going away and all the employees are coming back, but they've removed all infrastructure from on-prem. So it's like,
Exactly.
so, and they made this comment. They're like, we don't even have firewalls in the office, or that's the goal, is to not even have firewalls in the office. I'm like, okay, so what is it that you're going to do in the office? And so they're like listed it off. Print. Print was like a big one. Like if we need to print stuff out, we need to be able to have a VLAN where we can send stuff to a printer. They need the ability to have encrypted traffic between endpoints, which is easier to do, obviously, if they're on the same VLAN and you're not having to send it all the way out to the internet to just bring it right back. And then the third one was basically everything that we did for remote workers, access all of our infrastructure that lives somewhere else altogether.
Right. Right.
So this goes back to our conversation again. I keep coming back to it and going down rabbit holes, but talk to me about what you're seeing with your clients, because you asked a lot of questions, or you made a lot of points. Tor, VPNs, the idea behind privacy, and I have to say, it's been a long time since someone has actually used the word privacy in context of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, there was a while where they were intertwined, and it seemed like the last few years we're not hearing much about it. You had pretty much, other than GDPR a few years ago,
Right.
there really hasn't been at least the discussion here about privacy.
Right.
NIST put out their privacy framework similar to the cybersecurity framework, and some people are adopting it. You're seeing some companies that are implementing it, but we're not hearing a lot of the language on that, and which is kind of surprising considering all the breaches that we're having. Probably because the breaches are not really, everyone's focusing on ransomware. They're not really focusing on data dumps as much, although those two worlds are colliding now.
Sure.
So where do what happens with this issue with privacy? So it was interesting. We were with a bunch of family friends over the weekend, and they said, and one of the guys, I won't name the company, they suffered their second ransomware attack in the past, in 2 years. And so they had one last year. They thought they cleaned it up. It happened again just this past year. Probably a different actor, but could be the same actor. Who knows? And they're a U.S. subsidiary of a foreign company. And that foreign company does military work in that foreign country, and here they just do commercial stuff. Mm-hmm. So the commercial business and the military business are different. They're separate, but it's largely a crap show here. It sounds like. And so now their second time around, he's asking like, what's going on? What are we exposing? What are those things? Like, then they went into this whole rabbit hole about, do I accept cookies every time? Every website's asking for cookies. And I think a lot of people don't realize why that's there. That's primarily because of GDPR. And now everyone's saying, yeah, I'm tracking you. Click on this cookie. And I was just reading that, Google is looking to get away from cookies entirely.
Right.
For their own, and saying we're not going to support tracking of, which is kind of interesting since that's the major part of their business, the advertising. So the privacy aspect of a lot of what we do, between products that we use, the services, the websites we visit, I'd be hypocrite if I didn't say that we're not tracking people that come to our website.
Oh, sure.
we're throwing Facebook pixels left and right to see so that we can do retargeting advertising, what have you. Because, at the end of the day, we're still a business. Maybe, maybe I'll decide at some point that that's not worth the hassle and the exposure that I'm putting people through. But it's a thing that we're all affected for. But the interesting thing about privacy is that it affects our home life as much, if not more, than our corporate life. And so it's perhaps a good avenue to have the cybersecurity conversation when you're talking about privacy. I used to in my early days in security when I was in corporate, I used to go to a lot of the hacker conferences and what have you. And there was a gentleman that was he wrote a book called Into the Breach, Michael Santangelo. And this is early 2000s. And one of the things to say your employees will do the right thing about protecting your information if they understand what their true risks are. And it was kind of an interesting. So it's like, if they understand what they're doing and how that affects the company, and also taking a step back, if it affects them personally and they learn about how to protect themselves personally, they'll do the same thing on the corporate side. So that's always been our approach of kind of how teaching people about this kind of stuff and educate them, because ultimately this stuff is not going to be solved by a widget or a technology or what have you.
Right. It's going to be solved by people, right?
It's going to be solved by people. And so when you have Wes from Perch Security talks about this when if you look at the NIST framework, the initial parts of the initial framework can be solved by technology. But as you go further along, and the same thing with CMMC, when it comes to maturity levels, the more mature you go on the security side, it becomes more human related than technology related. It becomes more process and personal rather than
the stop gaps. Like what made you go to that next step to say this is probably okay? Like this really is for my CFO, right? Like this isn't some spoofed email. So I think I kind of want to pause for a moment, because I think you've brought up some really key points that are, there's like a lot of things like kind of to unpack. I was thinking about what you said about GDPR. We really don't have much else in the privacy space. And before I go back in time to talk about, the HIPAA compliance, and that started out as only a privacy rule.
Right.
We very recently had, CCPA go into place. Mm-hmm. And you either have those that are copycatting CCPA or they're copycatting GDPR at the state levels. And what's interesting is, while the approach is different than GDPR, obviously it's being more consumer focused. I think this comes back to, like you said, there's an overlap that changes some perspectives on what is really important to our people, our end users. And that fundamentally is my stuff, right? At work, it's not my stuff. It's not mine per se. And so I think, and I'm dealing with this in the school district here, where it's like, I'm forcing things like 2FA and some other items, right? And they're like, well, I don't care about my password that I use to log in to whatever application it is, because I don't use that credentials for my home stuff. It's not the same as what I use for banking. And while that may be true, what they're failing to realize is, if I can compromise any of their accounts to uncover information about them, then that's the rabbit hole that now leads to, I don't care what data you've given me. Right. It's enough to get my toehold to the next rung on that ladder and go, I now have enough information, maybe set up my own bank account that's in your name, right?
Yeah.
Or worse.
Is work the gateway to your personal data, or is your personal data the gateway to your work data? It can go either way.
Well, and I think you brought this up. If we're talking about the data dump as opposed to just making it not usable, I think this is more about the end user, because I think about the exploitation of an individual is far less or is far more difficult to pin that down on somebody, or to even get recourse for what you're doing, than if you target the entity, like say yours or my businesses, right? Because if I can buy a house, open credit cards, and assume your identity, Well, why do I need anything to do with your company? And
Right.
especially when I do that on a scale. And so if you catch me on one, well, if you think about like the equivalent of corporate espionage versus identity theft, they have very significant differences in consequences for the person that's been convicted.
Sure.
But you could make a fortune, over and over and over again. And there's really no way to even trace a lot of that because of the way it's been, they're siloed data sources that you're pulling from, right? How long does it take for someone to figure out that the Xbox has been compromised and they're listening to every conversation that goes through that microphone in the house? But go look at a corporate environment. How many Xboxes are sitting in your office, if you have any, right? So the
Yeah.
reason why I bring that up is I wanted to go back to HIPAA compliance for a minute. They have essentially the security rule and the privacy rule, and the tech side of that didn't really become all that popular until 2013 when they started adding consequences. We have separated for so long privacy from cybersecurity or the security side of things that I think to a degree we're missing out on what is the most important. The data is to be protected. The data is to be
Right.
kept private. That's the whole
Right.
point of this. And we're
Right.
not using that language. And because we don't use the language, the end users are going, doesn't matter to me because you're not talking about me. You're talking about data, and you've separated any sort of emotional relationship between me and the data. We start talking about privacy. We start talking about credit card, PII. People start to get sensitive, right? Like their medical records, their
Hmm.
credit cards, they get
Yeah.
sensitive about that. They don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it. Well, that's this, right? Like, what you're dealing with right now, VPNs, Tor networks, anything that I can hide about me, because obviously we're all perfect and we don't want anybody to know about our inner demons. But that's kind of where this is shifting, right? Like what you're seeing when I go home and work from home, it's not necessarily that my employer is worried about my network environment. In some cases, it's more the employee is worried about working from home.
Yeah. And you also get the the opposite where do I need my employer to snoop on my personal information when the other end of the privacy, the extreme there, where we're seeing that pushback with mobile device management.
Sure.
I'm not going to put that software on my personal device, and it's like, well, we're only asking you to put Duo on it so you can do two-factor authentication. Doesn't matter. They don't care. They look at it as a way as like the company is putting something on my personal stuff, and I don't want that to happen. So it's a tricky thing when it comes to separating those that situation.
Well, what's reasonable in that situation? I'm dealing with this in the school district right now. Actually, I'm doing a presentation to staff in 2 weeks on sort of cybersecurity at the very high level, but really about the enforcement that's coming on two-factor authentication for certain vendor apps that are now requiring it. And rather than just saying, "Oh, by the way, this has been turned on, and now I have 100 tickets to deal with," I'm going to give some guidance here, like, "Hey, you can use Google Authenticate or something along those lines, MyKey or another product." What is reasonable? Because by and large, most end users are probably checking their work mail on their personal phones. So how is that, any real different to, can you put Duo or some other app on your
Right.
phone?
Right.
What's the balance there?
Yeah, and if it's where now you're seeing, at least among our clients, so we deal with a lot of financial clients, and so where we're seeing them go is, all right, that's fine. We're either going to give you a device, or that's one direction that clients go in, and keeping everything separate.
Sure.
And if you don't have our device, you can't get to this stuff. You can't get to your corporate email, and that's fine. So they're not willing to take that level of risk of you not having some visibility onto it.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, and it's interesting on the MFA side, because it's like the MFA, is it intrusive? I mean, maybe. Duo is looking at more than just giving you a token code, right? They were looking at the posture of the device that it's on. They're seeing, are you up to date, or do you have the latest version of Android or iOS running? If you go into their further up their zero trust chain or whatever, they do even more posture stuff. So is that too intrusive?
Well,
Um,
let's assume
I don't know.
it is. Let's assume it is for a minute. I think about the fact that we've already got them putting their email on their device. So
Right.
I think that the conversation around the end user is neither here nor there about intrusion, right? Consumerism has defined what is or isn't intrusive, and it's called intrusive. It's called convenience.
Mhm.
So we'll put the dots, the echoes, the home, I'm trying to use not certain words so that it doesn't trigger somebody's
Right.
device in their house, but those are compromises that most users are willing to make. The convenience of my stove being able to be like, I better turn the oven off remotely, or my garage door is now being, controlled. There's conveniences that we're willing to sacrifice on the personal side that we don't even consider. That when we look at it from a work perspective, there's a lot better tool sets being used for that checklist that says, did I put my garage door on a different VLAN, right? Like, things that you probably should consider as a consumer that you don't have necessarily the skill set to do on your own as a consumer, right? That through work, those things become a possibility to improve the security posture for that other environment, whether it's for work or not. So I think that one of the questions that I've had, and maybe you have an answer to this, if I'm asking you to use Duo, should I limit as the employer Duo for work things, or should I give you the capability of also using Duo for things that you're using for personal stuff, maybe your
Right.
bank or other apps?
We've certainly done that on the password management end. And it's a way to like, hey, by the way, you're going to, and it's a separate thing. You have a separate vault for that.
Mm.
It makes sense certainly to do that, because this way, going back to what we talked about before, you teach them how to protect their personal stuff, that'll leak into helping them protect their corporate stuff ultimately.
So this raises another question that's actually been coming up on some of the town halls we do for MSP-Ignite. And the question that we most recently had was we got to talking at the end of the meeting about employee handbooks. So the question got raised, should all of my policies sort of be combined into one document, like a written information security plan? But that wasn't the term used because we're doing some education around like, hey, we're using CIS top 20. It doesn't talk about a WISP, right?
Right.
And then you've got frameworks. One calls it a plan and one calls it a policy. So depending on whether you use NIST or NYDFS, they use different language to describe
Right.
them, but they are in essence the same thing. So we started talking about it and we kind of went down a rabbit hole because I said, hey, you have an employee handbook, right? And how many pages is that? And it's like, well, 40, 50 pages. And I go, if I were to look at the table of contents, how many policies are kind of in there, like acceptable use of the internet? You won't do sexual harassment. The things that you're agreeing to that in a lot of cases you're signing off on the handbook, which is assuming that you've read it, as opposed to signing off on, say, chapter 2, which is, don't use your devices for things that are inappropriate, right? Like we will say don't use it for
Right.
personal stuff, which is easy, covers a lot of things, but that's not a reality. I mean, I might buy lunch from my work computer because I'm coming back to the office, like so many things there. Do you think that there's an opportunity to help on so an employee handbook has been around forever. Cybersecurity policies have been around for 20 seconds.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily associate an employee handbook as being a set of policies, but it is.
It is.
And cybersecurity has created a world that says password policy standalone. You will patch your computer standalone. At the end of the day, I think we need to go back to, if we talk to our end users and say, hey, you cited an employee handbook and agreed to all of these things, is it really fair for us to say that, or go more in your face with whether it's BYOD, the duos, the 2F actor type stuff, and say, hey, we want to participate with you as a person who has consumerism and home life that's just as critical and important to protect as our stuff. Is it basically that we've become so selfish at the corporate side that we've lost sight of the fact that people are still going to make the mistakes regardless of where, and inevitably they come back and haunt us?
Yeah. Are they they're bringing their home mistakes to work, or they're bringing their
Yeah,
work mistakes home?
which we definitely are dealing with right now because I've said go work from home.
Yeah.
I didn't say, hey, I'll be there tomorrow to redo your network so it
Right.
complies with corporate. I mean,
Right. So that your Xbox is not on the same VLAN as your work laptop.
and is that
Well,
even the problem to focus on, right? Because I think
mhm.
about how do you secure the endpoint? It goes back to what we were talking about, SASE. I mean, you could say our EDR software or our VPN type software is making it so that as soon as this device sees internet, all communication just went encrypted, and it can't, devices around it can't see it, and it can only go to a certain place.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it is actually, and that's why, kind of circling back to the SASE conversation, it's kind of why we're looking at that as a way to deploy it. Our own employees, we've been a virtual team for 5, 6, 7 years. And that's how we get around it. We not get around it. That's how we deploy it. We don't
That's
have a
that's how you're
firewall.
successful with it, right?
Yeah, that's how we're set. We've been eating our own dog food or drinking our own champagne, whatever
I
you
hope
want
it's
to
the
call it.
latter. I hope it's the
Yeah,
latter.
I hope
I mean,
so
I
too.
suppose it could be really good dog food. I mean,
Well,
I don't know what your dog eats. It might be,
hey, you never know.
tri-tip,
They have this refrigerated like fancy stuff now.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Dogs
Off
eat better
topic.
than people.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's been kind of our way of doing it, and so that became a model. So when now you have clients that said, to your question, where the office that didn't have a firewall, and all they were doing were printing. We had a client actually just was recently acquired. They had a big office in LA and they had a big office overseas, and everybody else was spread out all over the world. Yeah, and they had no infrastructure at all. The
Mm-hmm.
only thing they had was a bunch of printers back at the home office. And it was funny because they had, they did a lot of work for the big banks. And so we constantly had to answer third party due diligence questionnaires on their behalf. And we were going through it and they're asking all these questions like, none of this stuff is relevant because they don't have anything there. There's no infrastructure there to put some protections around. So we kind of had to build this idea or this model around, okay, their stuff is here, their servers are in Amazon or something like that,
Sure.
their production development environment is in Azure, all this kind of thing. But then when they're doing their regular work, which is mostly just files on Box and emails in Office 365, this is how they do it. And it's interesting. We almost had to educate them. We're educating these giant banks on this is how we're deploying security for this virtual, for the lack of a better term, company.
You bring up something as we're approaching sort of the end of the episode that you could almost say is its own episode in and of itself, and that is frameworks or questionnaires, cybersecurity questionnaires that are being put on your clients' plates or being put on your plate to answer, often ask questions that are so extremely irrelevant to the client because they don't have the infrastructure that was by design what these were written for. I actually have a client right now that just got hit with the HECVAT light questionnaire, which banks put to higher education. I'm looking at this questionnaire going, okay, roughly a dozen employees. They all work from home. They all have almost every single app they use is a cloud-defined application from Salesforce to, say, Google Enterprise.
Right.
And these questions are asking like business continuity, disaster recovery, in the event that there is a failure of your primary software or whatever, that you can bounce back in, and please tell us how much time. And you're like, let me call Salesforce, right? And Salesforce is going to be like, well, what do you mean? Because Salesforce's model for their BCDR is not going to be remotely tied to what you and your 12-person company need to do.
Right.
So how do you, I mean, you've seen this as much as I have, if not more. How do you go about answering that? Like to with credibility, go back to somebody, an organization like a bank who's saying, you have to address these following questions.
Yeah. What's your BCDR? Our BCDR is you pick up and you go someplace else that has internet access and you plug in. That was the BCDR, literally speaking. In fact, we had
I have Backupify.
we have a client that was going through a similar process when investors come in for pensions, for example, like New York Department of Pensions or whatever for a specific group. they'll come in and they'll do a due diligence on and then a smaller investment company that is a piece of that.
Sure.
And we had to go through that. And so one of them was during the pandemic.
Right.
And so they're all working from home. They're actively trading. It's like, when was the last time you did a BCDR test? And the compliance officer turned them, we're doing right now. It's live. It's live and it's working. So,
right.
That's the
6 months in.
Yeah, exactly. We need no big sign of number of days in so far.
Right.
But it's one of those things where we have to deal with that. And so there's a lot of conversations around, NA related marks on these due diligence forms. And it took a while and iterations and explaining and then showing attestation. That's one thing that I think MSPs can do a little bit better job at when it comes to, it's one thing to say, oh, hey, I have a policy, check, or here's the policy. All right, now show me that you're actually putting it in practice, and showing that evidence is now, I think, the next level of that thing that we're probably going to have to go through, and we certainly have had to do that on behalf of clients. So that part's going to be interesting. For sure.
I think it's funny the way you described those sort of three scenarios. The policy check or evidence to support the policy check, I think, are almost easier than when you put down NA, right? Because if I put NA or no, I now have to write more of an explanation and show more evidence than the other way around. So this comes back to kind of how this all started with regards to, privacy and people, is that we have to educate people on the idea that the model that these things were written for isn't the same anymore.
Right.
Man. So there you have it, folks. Privacy, SASE. We definitely are wrapping up being truly SASE. So Rafi, where can people find you?
I'm either Rafi Jimgochin or Triada.net and most of the social medias out there. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and what have you. Our company is at triadanet.com, and hit me up.
Well, this has been a great conversation, raw conversation, if you will. For those of you listening, this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Have a great week.